There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. We're here today with Jaime Punishill. He is the Chief Marketing Officer at Lionbridge. Jaime, how's it going today, man?
Awesome. Thanks so much, Logan. Having a great day.
Awesome. Well, good to hear, and really glad that we're able to connect, especially knowing that you're going through a bit of a brand reboot with your company, so making for long days. And I appreciate you making some time to share your expertise on going through that process with our audience here. I think you've got some really practical takeaways to share with some other marketers who are maybe sitting in the same seat or will be at some point soon and having to face, a large brand reboot. So excited to dive into that topic. But before we do, Jaime, I would love for you to give our audience a little bit of context about who you are and, what the team at Lionbridge is up to these days.
Sure. I'm fairly new to Lionbridge and fairly new to this industry. I joined last November. Lionbridge is one of the world's leaders in language services, in linguistic expertise, really in global go-to-market support. So as companies take their brands and their products to different cultures, different languages, different markets, that's where we have a long time, 20-plus year leadership in the industry. And, the whole industry is going through a transition. And we've got a new CEO and a whole new executive team, so it's a pretty exciting time over here.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, Jaime. You mentioned this is not your first time going through a major, brand reboot of an older established company. So tell us a little bit about what it's like going through this the second go round before we get to some of the talking points that you mentioned that we'd like to share about what it's like to go through that.
Yeah, well, look, it's great to have had the experience of the first time. That's for sure, because it's not an easy mountain to climb. I most recently, before Lionbridge, was at TIAA, which is a large institutional money manager and financial advice, really financial services company who, as you may or may not know, did its first national advertising campaign and rebranding program a couple of years back, and I had the fortune of helping them think through that. So a lot of the lessons of taking an organization like that, which had really not had sort of a single unified brand, really rethinking its go-to-market digital engagement strategy, et cetera, have been key lessons and learnings that have guided us as we've set up the program for thinking through how we take Lionbridge, which is a real history of acquisitions and building up a company. And we're in 47 countries, or we have offices in 47 countries. We support customers in just about every conceivable market. We help folks with 350 plus languages, and sort of stitching together the last 20 years of global growth and telling one cohesive story across every industry and every dimension is a fun challenge, but a lot of work.
Nice. Awesome. Well, definitely some hard-earned lessons that you've experienced in going through this and now going through it a second time, helping, a brand with a major reboot. I think you've got some valuable things to share with our audience. The first thing that you mentioned as we were talking about this offline, Jaime, was, rethinking everything to a foundational or an atomic level, backing up maybe further than you think you need to in this process. Tell us a little bit about that in the context of this brand rebuilding topic.
Yeah, so I think it's something you watch a lot. I watch a lot of mistakes when people they either have they find a new technology or they've got a new thing to do and they try to just apply it against the old world as it is. And what you get then is sort of a new version of the old, right? I like to, if you automate a bad process, you just have a faster way of doing things badly.
Yes.
Right? It is sort of a good way to think about it. And I think when you're going through an exercise like this, if you are hoping that to say this, my old boss, God bless her, would repeat to us almost ad nauseum, branding starts at home. And so much of a brand rebirth or a rebrand of an organization is really about galvanizing the internal culture around this new belief, this new message, this sort of new rallying cry, such as it were. And if you're going to do that, you've really got to unpack all the way back underneath to understand how people got to where they were. And so I'll give you a really sort of simple example that sounds like mom and apple pie, but I'm often struck by how people don't do it. And you take something like SEO, right? SEO in and of itself is not a terribly difficult thing. But you see a lot of companies struggle at it, and then when you unpack why they're struggling, you realize that they haven't gone all the way back to the beginning and said, how do I even think about creating a piece of content and pushing it out into the market? And so at TIA is a good example. We had to go back and actually rewrite the entire marketing brief to make sure that SEO content and search terms were inside of the beginning of the brief process, and then retrain every marketer who was thinking about how would you go thinking about a piece of content so that SEO was up front, so that as it pushed all the way through, the content was designed with that execution in mind. Whereas you see in many organizations, I shouldn't say most, in many cases, you see folks do the exact same thing they've always done and then say, super, now let's do some search optimization to it. And of course, it's never that effective. And I think that applies against any of these new activities, right? You think about, one of the things that we do a lot of is help folks go into new markets. Well, if you know you're going into a new market and you're just going to take a campaign or a product or an approach that you've already developed in one market and just bolt it into a new market, that's not nearly going to be as effective as if you go all the way back and you say, I got to design a product that works in multiple markets. And so, as we're looking at that here, we literally are thinking about every process, every piece of content, the website, all of our social channels, our whole approach to content strategy. Literally think about everything as if you were starting fresh. And it's an opportunity to do that too. You get to question every assumption. So don't miss that window. But if you don't, it's like, tearing down a 2-story house and trying to put a 110-story skyscraper on it. It was built to support a 2-story house. That foundation was not built for a 110, story skyscraper. And so if you don't go all the way down, you really limit what you can build on top of it.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic analogy. You've got to back up a little bit further, maybe a step or two further than you're actually thinking. And while that can be daunting, what I caught that you just said there is that, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to question a lot of assumptions. It's a lot of opportunity for a fresh start. So while it can be daunting, there's also a great opportunity in this process if you're willing to back up far enough. The next thing, Jaime, you mentioned that you found very, very helpful to keep in mind in a sort of rebranding or a brand reboot process like this is to design with change in mind. And I think you had a good analogy of, your plan and strategy alongside a GPS and picking the spot where you're going when you set your GPS directions on your smartphone. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, look, I think there's not a business person, much less a marketer, who can, with a straight face, look at you and say, here's exactly where the organization's going to be in 12 months or 24 months or 36 months. And yet so much of our planning process is designed with these very, very long cycles and long programs in mind, with, again, if you haven't done that first step where you're rethinking your structure, you're just planning on a different cadence than the world is operating now. I can't tell you if augmented reality or conversational search agents will be really important in September, but they're probably going to be relatively important sometime soon for many businesses. Mm-hmm. So how do I structure a really long marketing plan, a really long program or campaign that doesn't have flexibility built into it? And so what I encourage my teams to do, and when we're thinking about our planning, even our budgeting, is to your point, I think about it very much like a GPS exercise, like hopping in my car. I know my point of departure and I know my point of arrival. And with few exceptions, those are fairly well understood, and those are fairly certain. What I can't tell you is at any given moment exactly the path that we're going to take, right? Mm-hmm. So, every week, just about, I'm driving up to Boston from Connecticut, where I live. It's a roughly 3-hour drive, plus or minus, and I go into Waze, and it knows my office. But I will tell you, almost every week is a slightly different path, because you just don't know how traffic is going to build up ahead, or the accident, or the cops, et cetera. And I think that's no different in business. And so smart marketers, I think these days, are literally building some agility and flexibility into their process to give them some optionality, because the world is just pivoting so fast with so many new mediums and so many different trends that if you haven't built that in, you've literally designed failure into your system because you're too rigid.
Today's growth story is all about search engine marketing. The company we're highlighting is SentinelOne. This challenger cybersecurity brand was set out to disrupt the endpoint protection space. Their brand was top-notch, their product was innovative, but they were struggling to gain traction online in an already developed industry. Then they found Directive Consulting, a B2B search marketing agency. Within the first quarter of working with Directive, SentinelOne was able to increase their organic traffic by 128% and overall lead volume by an outstanding 251%. Now, I have a hunch that Directive can get these kind of results for you too. So head over to directiveconsulting.com and request a totally free custom proposal. That's directiveconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to this interview.
Awesome. The next thing, Jamie, you wanted to talk about was, I think goes off of that really well. You mentioned, the speed at which things are moving. And so as we think about our buyers, one of the things that you mentioned is really critical in this sort of process is assuming the global nature of your buyers. Shed a little light on that for us.
Yeah, I think in a world where we are digitally led in lots of our interactions, and there are a few exceptions to that, clearly. And there are certain businesses, if you're in a regulated market where you can only work in one, locale, this is probably a little less relevant. But for the rest of us, the minute you put up the website, the minute you put up the social account or the blog or whatever, you instantaneously have an audience in the billions. And you can't control, by and large, where that audience is coming from. I think I shared, when I was part of the team, in fact, I led the team that developed social media for Citibank, 10 years ago. And it was literally my face on the first Twitter account that went live. And it was really for Citibank North America. But I couldn't stop the guys in Brazil or the people in Singapore from discovering that account and asking us questions. And we weren't structured for that by any stretch of the imagination. And that was, 10 years ago, and, a few 100 million mobile, smartphones ago. And so if you're not assuming that your audience is going to come from lots of different places, then you're already ill prepared, whether that's the language that you choose to do business in, the traffic, the shipping, the payments. You can go right through the list of things that you might need, small business or large enterprise. But the global markets exist now, and that globality, I think there's again just a new thing. Forget the political environment and the noise that's going on in the world. It is 100% clear that more and more corporations and more buyers are operating as if it's a global marketplace, which is also a super exciting opportunity, but quite a different thing.
Yeah. So the next thing that I know you mentioned is foundational in this sort of approach for you, at least, almost is a little bit counter to that point of thinking about the differences and the different challenges that you're going to have to overcome, in also not losing sight of the commonality. So I think you put it well as we were chatting offline, Jamie, is assuming more commonality in your audience than you might first expect. Tell us a little bit about how you've approached that and what you've learned in doing a rebranding project and how this comes into play there.
Yeah, and I think this is part of any marketing exercise, much less something like a rebranding project, where if you're really taking a step back and looking at the world from your buyer's view in, and trying to understand the differences in your buyers, and the different messages or the ways in which you can engage with that customer set. We hear lots of terms now: hyper personalization, hyper targeting, and so on and so forth. And your head will explode if you try to come up with the 3,700 permutations. And I'm sure right now there's a couple of guys getting ready to email me about how they're going to have AI solutions that'll help me hyper target. But I think it misses the most important point about people, and I think you see this inherent in say Apple's marketing, which looks for the essence of humanity that really will stretch across the globe. That focuses on, they don't try to be different in every market. They actually try to figure out what is the core essence of humanity in every market. And we're not all Apple, but if you focus that way, I think, I use a metaphor or a sort of an analogy. 99% of the DNA of a rat and a human are the same, and that's really important for things like testing drugs or beauty products or other things like that we don't want to test on humans. That similarity really matters. Now, the 1% matters too, because most of us don't like to think of ourselves as all that close to sort of a gray rodent with a bad rap for the plague. So differences matter, and they can matter a lot, but we spend all of our time focusing on 1%, which can lead you down really a complex path of unnecessary differentiation, when in reality, most of your buyers have similar problems. They have slightly different needs at slightly different moments, and they'll resonate with slightly different things. But we're really, as humans, more alike than we are different. That's a much simpler approach to your marketing. If you start with the assumption, how do I find as much commonality as I can and focus only on essential difference?
Yeah, I love it, Jamie. The last thing I know you wanted to touch on was, thinking about your team. So if we think about, you're taking a brand in a new direction, and rebranding is a huge undertaking, and obviously there are a lot of people that contribute to this sort of effort. So thinking about your team very critically and how you can equip them to make this transition and what is the right fit. So tell us quickly, what you've learned in that area and what people should be thinking about on this point with a project like this.
Yeah, this is a completely unscientific statement, but anytime I've gone into any sort of change management, big transition like exercise, I kind of assume that 40% of the folks just aren't going to they're just not going to make the transition. Whether they are unwilling, they are too tethered, they are unable, however you choose to view that crew, there are lots of folks that just aren't going to make the transition. And I think more often than not, I watch folks go in and try to drive a change or a transformation, and they pretty much assume that they can just bring nearly 100% of people along for the ride. And I think that's a dangerous assumption going in. And I think as a leader, that really leaves you with two things. One, you've got to really understand you're asking, if you take the first 3 or 4 things that we talked about, if you're rethinking things at the atomic level, you might have folks who've been doing essentially the same thing the same way for the last 20 or 25 years. That is an awful big ask to ask them to rethink, to question every sacred cow and think about things at the atomic level. And so, one, you've got to be watching to see, who can really make that transition. And know that some folks just aren't going to, and you're not doing anybody any favors, not them and not the rest of your team, by keep trying to force people who they just can't pivot. But the flip side of it is there's also a tremendous responsibility to embrace learning and education and really equip the team to start to look for ways to think differently and celebrate the new approaches and frankly create the learning environment for all of the employee set to become a new fashion of themselves. Otherwise, you're just doomed to you could do the same thing the same way, just slightly differently, and you won't end up with any kind of a change outcome that you're really looking for.
Yeah, definitely want to avoid that and be able to head where you want to head, especially with a large undertaking such as this. Well, Jaime, I really appreciate you sharing some of these nuggets from your experience doing not one but multiple brand reboots in your time at various marketing roles. So if anybody listening to this, Jaime, would like to ask you some follow-up questions or reach out and stay connected, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Yeah, you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. There's only 4 Punishills in the universe, which is a story unto itself, which I'm happy to share with anybody. So if you can find me on LinkedIn, or they could just email me directly. The hard part is spelling my name right, but if you go to jaime.punishill@lionbridge.com, and my first name is Jaime, I'm more than happy to help in any way I can.
Awesome. This has been great. Jaime, thanks for coming on the show.
Real pleasure, Logan. Thanks so much for having me.
Becoming a thought leader doesn't just happen. If you want to build a strong personal brand and extend your reach online and offline, you need a plan. Want help developing yours? Check out Impact Summit. This one-day event is bringing together best-selling authors, professional athletes, influential CEOs, and emerging entrepreneurs, all for one purpose: to equip you to lead, influence, and inspire. Whether you're looking to build a lasting legacy with your business or extend the reach of your brand, Impact Summit speakers will share inspiring stories and practical lessons to help you on your way. Did we mention a session on launching and growing a podcast? You guessed it. You'll hear from Sweetfish Media's own James Carberry during that session. You won't want to miss all of these influencers and leaders coming together in Salt Lake City on October 13th. Ready to learn more? Check out influencerinc.co/Impact Summit. B2B Growth listeners can get 15% off the price of their tickets for this event by using the promo code SWEETFISH, SWEETFISH. So use that code, get your tickets today, and get ready to grow your brand and your influence at Impact Summit 2018.